Hey people. So I came across a story from Indonesia. I think sort of serves as a poignant case study of the issue I'm going to be talking about more broadly in the video, which is prison overcrowding and prison conditions around the world. Um, and then before I get into that, about the incident in question, a fire broke out at this prison in Tangerang, outside Jakarta, Indonesia. Tangerang's a large city that's part of the Jakarta metropolitan area. So apparently the prison dated from 1972 and its electrical system hadn't been updated since then. So this is an almost 50-year-old prison. It was overcrowded. Apparently cells that were, or facilities that were designed for 40 people had over 100. And when this fire broke out, a lot of inmates were sleeping. Guards apparently opened some of the doors, but they couldn't reach Block C, where apparently the worst damage was, and 44 inmates at least have died, and presumably others are injured. So this is a major incident. I'm not sure when the last prison fire or prison incident in Indonesia was, but it's not surprising. Across Southeast Asia and across Latin America as well, and probably parts of Africa and in other parts of the world which frankly have developing economies, this is a major issue, i.e. prison overcrowding. Now, just a caveat here before I continue. Before anyone sort of jumps into conclusions and thinks, oh, I'm a British guy, I don't know the situation here and so on. I understand that in developing countries, putting resources into offenders, making better conditions for offenders probably isn't the priority. I mean, often there are situations where there is crippling poverty in the country generally. I'm not saying necessarily in Indonesia, it's a developing economy, but perhaps a better example would be in Central America. Um, so it's simply not a priority. The resources, need to be spent on healthcare, on developing the economy and developing living condition for law-abiding citizens. In this case, I understand most of the offenders were convicted of drug offences, so presumably some of those are violent, some of them aren't. Um, but there is a thought, to take away from this, at least that I would propose. These men, and I assume it's a male prison, they were criminals. They were convicted of criminal offences, but they were being punished for what they'd done. This is still a tragedy. They still presumably have families, um, wives, dependents, maybe parents. Two of the victims were foreign nationals, one from Portugal, one from South Africa. So, from a human perspective, criminals or not, it's still a tragedy, and no one should take pleasure from something like this. Clearly, there's going to need to be a thorough investigation as to why this happened, why there wasn't enough fire extinguishers. Perhaps well, I was going to say, if escape routes are blocked, but obviously being a prison, there won't be escape routes by nature anywhere in the world. Um, there's going to need to be a thorough investigation. I understand the Human Rights Department in the Indonesian government is going to make an inquiry into this. The very fact there is a human rights representative shows how far Indonesia has come. Um, But this could very well have taken place in the Philippines or in Malaysia or other parts of Southeast Asia or Central America. And it's a problem. Um, Earlier this year, incidentally, it's not always, these sort of incidents are not always due to accidents. Earlier this year in Ecuador, up to 79 inmates died in a massacre in prison violence over gang supremacy. I mean, when you hear some of the things that go on in Latin America in prisons, it really is as horrendous as what terrorist groups do. And I apologize for the graphic details here, but you hear reports of inmates being beheaded. That was the case in Brazil a few years ago. There's been examples in Honduras, and this year in Ecuador, Mexico. So, this is something that happens far too often. I'm not suggesting there's any easy answer, um, but to me, it reiterates why there has to be control in prisons. You have to have a system where guards and authorities have the upper hand, where they have the power. When you have a situation where gangs start taking over, and I'm not saying this is the case in Tangerang, that was different, that was a fire. But in the case of Ecuador, I mean, that is a bad situation when the inmates have the power and, they're killing each other over a certain gang dominance. What I always think of in these incidents is okay, again, these people have done bad things, they're in prison for a reason, but they're not all going to be the same level of criminality. You could have senior gang leaders who, have ruthlessly killed people, and you could also have relatively minor offenders who may not be at that level. Um, but I'm conservative on crime. I'm not anti-prison. I believe that if people commit crime, they should go to prison. And Indonesia's a sovereign state. I wouldn't, tell the Indonesians how they should do it. But I do believe basic human rights is universal, and I think that there has to be an investigation as to why this has happened. Because let's say someone sent to prison for, I don't know what the sentence would be, 10 years for a drug offense. Okay, they're serving their time. They're being held to account for what they've done. But part of the sentence is not being earned. Um, you know, that's still awful for the person's family. So no one should take pleasure from something like this. Um, but like I say, I understand in developing countries, often putting money into the prison system, improving conditions is not the priority. But to be honest, when you see prisons in some countries, they look like human battery farms. I mean, it's basically people looking like hens in a chickens in a battery farm. It's pretty awful, and inevitably that's going to have severe impact on people's mental health, on their well-being. Um, And I'm not coming from the point of view of some bleeding heart liberal. I mean, some of these guys have, they're bad people. They've done bad things. But I think society always needs to be looking forward. Hold criminals to account, punish them. But, there needs to be a situation where prison systems are run that offenders don't have the upper hand. So you don't have this sort of brutality happening as in Ecuador. And again, there's no easy answer to that. In Britain, we often talk about overcrowding in prisons, and we do have overcrowded prisons. We have the highest prison population in Europe. It's about 100,000. We have cells that are designed for two people that have four or five inmates. That's obviously not comparable to other parts of the world, but it's still a problem. And we have had unrest. Most recently, I believe the last major case of unrest was at Birmingham Winton Green. The famous example is Strangeways Prison in Manchester. In those sort of situations, and there have been violent prison riots in America, New Mexico 1980 and Attica in New York 1973 or 71, and they both involved multiple deaths. So, as a conservative on crime, I believe if people hurt society, they have to pay a price. And I hate drugs. I hate the impact that drugs have. So, by no means that I say there shouldn't be consequences for knowingly getting involved in drug offences. Um, but there has to also be a situation where, you know, tragedies like this, disasters like this are avoided as much as possible. So, for example, if the electricity system hadn't been updated since 1972, that clearly contributed to it, or likely contributed to it. Um, Apparently, campaigners in Indonesia have said that more minor offenders shouldn't be sent to prison. Well, it depends on the nature of the offence. Just because it's not involving violence doesn't mean it's minor. What I would say is if you have a drug addict who maybe stole from a shop, probably prison's not the right approach. But drug lords, yeah, they should be in prison. Absolutely. or drug dealing, or extorting people for money, that sort of thing, yeah, I believe that should be prison. But anyway, that's just my thoughts. So I hope people don't misunderstand me here. I'm not, you know, they were in prison for a reason, but at the same time, if you're glorifying this or taking pleasure from it, I would say that's pretty callous, regardless of who the subject is. Society, an organized society has to hold criminals to account, but it also can't reduce itself to the level of the criminal, i.e., uh, be callous and inhumane. So I hope lessons are learned from this. Um, but a final point. I understand that I'm coming from a developed country. It's not the same situation. I fully appreciate in a country like Honduras, which has staggeringly high violent crime rates. Probably 99% of people would have no sympathy for inmates, and I totally understand that. I mean, if some hardened gang member had killed my family member, I wouldn't really care if they died in prison. But governments have to, they have the responsibility to deal with these things. Um, so yeah, I hope lessons are learned and this doesn't happen again. But in terms of one last point, actually, I should say because it's related. In terms of overcrowding, I don't agree with those on the left who say, "Oh, well, let's just free inmates." I think honestly, the answer is in building more prisons. Why? Because when more prisons are built, sure, it costs money. Everything costs money. But think of the long term. You build more prisons, it eases pressure on the existing prison population because inevitably, if an inmate is selling just with one other inmate rather than four, that's going to ease tensions. It's going to ease pressure on prison staff. So to win-win in that sense. Yes, it costs money. Yes, they have to be built somewhere, but I think it can enable reducing recidivism because if you have a system which is overcrowded and that it just builds resentment in the inmates and therefore they're more likely to reoffend when they're released, then that's going to be more expensive in the long run. If you have effective modern prisons that are built that are tough but humane, that can be a very practical thing. Of course, they have to be built somewhere, and probably wherever they're built, people will complain. But there has to be a wider utilitarian approach, which is wider society. Um, so I think that's the answer. I do not agree with the left, oh, we lock up too many people. I don't agree with that. There are many, many serious offences that don't even result in a custodial outcome. And I know I'm distracting a bit from the main subject here, but I do agree with the left. I don't think too many people are locked up. I think the issue is that there's overcrowding. That's not the same as too many people are locked up. And I think what's happening today in Britain is judges are reluctant to issue custodial sentence solely for that reason. So they're not looking at the gravity of the crime. They're saying, I don't want to jail this person because it'll just add to the population. Well, that shouldn't be how justice is determined. Justice should be determined on the gravity of the crime. But anyway, getting back to Indonesia, I hope there is a full investigation. Um, talking about whether there be compensation to family or not might not go down well. But those people were in jail for their offences. Their punishment was prison. It wasn't to be burned alive. That's an awful thing, and it shouldn't have happened.